Hello everyone, I am the Meta Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews under the deck text. On this episode of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a Faith's Commander from the Adventures in the Forgotten Realms Commander Precon's Prosper Tome-Bound. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. The best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For just $1, patrons get early access to certain videos on YouTube. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Prosper is a 1/4 Tiefling Warlock with Death Touch for 2 generic, 1 black, and 1 red. He has 2 triggered abilities. His Mystic Arcanum ability has you impulsive draw at the beginning of your end step. Fortunately, you have until the end of your next turn to play that card. Then his Pact Boon ability creates a treasure whenever you play a card from Exile. With the way this ability is worded, it also triggers whenever you play lands from Exile. This ability is one of the most used in this deck and you can get so many treasures from Prosper. Let's see how. A couple of abilities immediately come to mind: Suspend, Cascade, and Foretell. These trigger Pact Boons since those spells are being cast from Exile. It was quite challenging finding which spells to include because if you impulsively draw into a card with Suspend but no mana cost, not 0 costed but literally no mana cost, then you can't cast them nor suspend them since they're not in your hand. However, Lotus Bloom, Mox Tantalite, and Soul Talisman are too good to pass up. The first 2 are free to suspend and the Talisman only costs 1 to do so. You do have to wait 3 turns afterwards to get them though. That being said, if you plan ahead and suspend them so that their last time counter is removed the turn you already have Prosper in play, you get a free treasure and mana rock. Same goes for Profane Tutor and Wheel of Fate. These are too good to pass up. Even though you can't cast them or do anything with them if you impulsively draw into them, at least you're able to cascade into them and cast them that way without having to wait like when they're suspended. The other cards in the deck with Suspend can be hard cast if needed, Gargadon and Rousing Refrain. However, that's obviously something we'd prefer avoiding. Gargadon is an excellent beater for just 2 mana. Rousing Refrain is possibly the best suspend spell here since it has the potential of generating a ton of mana for us, and then it suspends itself to do it all over again. I wish Prosper would have been blue so as to include all the additional upkeep effects. As for Cascade, the deck's running Aurora Phoenix, Bituminous Blast, Throes of Chaos, and Wild Magic Sorcerer. The Phoenix is a decent flying beater for 6 mana that passes the vanilla test. It also has the potential of returning to our hand to cascade all over again. Bituminous Blast is a bit costly for just dealing 4 damage to a creature, which more often than not is only good enough to get rid of hate bears in this format, but it is an instant that cascades, and it still does get rid of any hate bear. If not, it can be used to finish off any creature that survived combat. Throes of Chaos only cascades and does nothing else, but for 4 mana you can essentially free cast anything you reveal with mana value 3 or less. You can also recast it from your graveyard by discarding a land. Wild Magic Sorcerer doesn't have Cascade per se, but it gives Cascade to the first spell you cast from Exile each turn. Since Prosper has us being able to cast the spell until the end of our next turn, any instance we exile we can cast during an opponent's turn to trigger the Sorcerer. Being able to essentially cast 2 cards from Exile and get all the benefits from it seems pretty busted, especially since Cascade casts the spell from Exile. Poison the Cup and Rise of the Dreadmarn are the foretell cards in the deck. We do have to pay 2 generic to foretell them, but they're instant so we can then cast them whenever we need them. So if we have the mana to spare, we can exile them and then cast them at a more suitable time. Rise of the Dreadmarn in particular is such a good card. If anyone wipes the board, then we get an army for it while everyone else has nothing, all for just leaving 1 black mana open. Dream Devourer takes it a step further, potentially being one of the best cards in the deck. Each non-land card in our hand gets Foretell. Not only that, but its cost gets reduced by 2 also. Since this is part of the effect, it still holds true even if the demon leaves the battlefield. This means that we can potentially cast all of our spells from Exile, triggering Prosper each time we do. This should go in every Prosper deck. Another way we can trigger Pact Boon is by impulsive draw. However, before I get into that obvious interaction, let's first see the core of the deck, playing with other players' cards. Unlike with silver bordered cards, we can't actually draw from opponents' decks or anything like that. But the way this is achieved with black bordered cards is by playing those cards from Exile. You find some prisoners, share the spoils, and Ornate Kanzashi allow us to do just that. The first card is just so busted. It only costs 2 mana and it's an instant. We get to choose the best card from the top 3 of an opponent's library and then the other 2 get exiled, so they can't even use them. Ornate Kanzashi requires paying 2 and tapping, but it's a small price to pay to play with the top card of an opponent's library. Share the Spoils is even better since it exiles the top card of everyone's library. We can then play the best cards we can that turn before opponents get a chance to. Then for each card we play this way, we exile 1 from the top of our library. Since practically every card in this deck is synergistic to the main strategy, they might not even be worth an opponent's time to cast or play. They might just end up playing their own cards or someone else's. Cunning Rhetoric also lets us impulsively draw from an opponent's library, but only if they attack us, since they undoubtedly understand that our deck is all about playing things from exile, and then they might eventually realize that we're taking everyone else's toys, so they might opt into not attacking us altogether. So it's win-win. Valki, God of Lies is a great card at 2 mana since it allows us to exile a creature from an opponent's hand, and then we can transform him into it for just X mana. So it's always disruptive and sometimes very useful. However, the main reason for running Valki is his backside, Tybalt Cosmic Imposter. Unfortunately, with the rules update to how Cascade interacts with modular double-face cards, we can no longer cascade into Valki to then free cast Tybalt off the Cascade trigger. But that's not a big deal. Tybalt is still amazing in the deck. Tybalt gives you an emblem that lets you cast cards exiled with him, which is great because his +2 ability has us exile the top card of each library, essentially giving us 4 times the card advantage. His -3 not only functions as removal, but has the potential for Thievery as well. His ultimate isn't really the main reason for hunting him, but it's amazing against decks that play with the graveyard. However, he's mostly in it for his first 2 loyalty abilities and the emblem. Etali Primal Storm and Chaos Wand also lets us play from the top of an opponent's library, but entirely for free. Etali is similar to Tybalt in that it exiles the top card from each library. However, you free cast any number of spells from those for free when it triggers, meaning that you can potentially get 4 free spells before opponents are even able to declare blockers, all on a 6/6 for 6 mana. Chaos Wand lets us dig through the top of an opponent's library until it hits an instant or sorcery. With so many splashy spells in Commander, we might be able to free cast quite the bomb. Even if we don't, ramp spells, card draw, or removal is never a bad thing to hit. Even if we hit a counter spell, we can just leave it exiled. Opposition Agent also lets us play cards from an opponent's library. With so many ramp effects or tutors in the format, and even if you're in a tutorless pod, people are always ramping or cracking some fetch land, whether the cheap ones or the expensive ones. Being able to exile their best card and then cast it later on is amazing, even without considering how it synergizes with Prosper. It's just great disruption. Muse Vessel and Fiend of the Shadows are also disruptive because they exile cards from an opponent's hand. Unfortunately, you can only activate Muse Vessel at sorcery speed, but at least you don't have to cast it in the same turn. You can continuously exile cards from hands and then eventually pay 1 to be able to cast 1 until the end of the turn. Fiend of the Shadows does something similar, but when it connects with combat damage. As long as the card remains exiled, you can play it, even if the vampire is no longer on the battlefield because it's part of the same trigger. It's a 3/3 flyer, so chances are that you might find someone to swing into. The only downside to these effects is that the opponent is the one who chooses which card they're going to exile from their hand. Hedonist Trove helps us steal cards exiled from graveyards. The only downside apart from its hefty casting cost is being able to only cast 1 card exiled with it per turn. So use your opponent's turns to cast instants with it. However, mana isn't that much of an issue with this deck since Prosper is creating so many treasures after all. Now, you might be asking, but how are we going to be casting all of those cards? The deck's black-red, we can't cast stolen cards unless the effect allows us to spend mana of any color to cast it. Well, that's what all the treasures are for. They're cracked for mana of any color. If that weren't enough, the deck's running Felwar Stone, Chromatic Lantern, Exotic Orchard, City of Brass, Mana Confluence, and to a certain extent Reflecting Pool. Not only are their first 2 amazing mana rocks in their own right, but they're amazing here since they allow us to get the mana needed to cast stolen spells or activate the abilities of stolen cards. Same goes with the 4 lands. Reflecting Pool can tap for any mana so long as we have City of Brass or Mana Confluence, but if we also have Exotic Orchard, then it can tap for whatever we need. Either way, it's still a great land. Speaking of using treasures to be able to cast all the things we're stealing, we have to take advantage of that treasure creation readily available in the command zone. Goldspan Dragon and Krark Clan Ironworks help give our treasure tokens double mileage. Unfortunately, the Ironworks only gives us double colorless, but that's fine since it's still doable mana. Either way, we're going to see how else we can abuse Krark Clan Ironworks in a moment. The dragon is just so good here regardless. It creates treasures when it attacks and gets targeted by a spell, and it's a 4/4 with flying and haste, all for 5 mana. Grim Hireling has a similar treasure creating trigger, but when creatures you control connect with combat damage. And even then, it's only once per opponent hit. That being said, if you hit all 3 opponents, you get 6 treasure tokens. If that weren't enough, its activated ability can be used as creature removal, even against indestructible creatures. Sorin also helps doubling up treasure mileage by literally doubling the amount of treasure tokens we're creating. This ability is just so good in this deck, especially considering that it only costs 3 mana to cast. So if we're playing on curve, we can get this out before Prosper and then start doubling up on treasures. Same goes for Academy Manufactor. If we're playing on curve, we can get this out before Prosper. Academy Manufactor is a card that I have not lost a single moment of excitement over ever since seeing it spoiled for the first time. Clues and Food might not seem so powerful in this deck, but recall Krark Clan Ironworks. If every treasure we create also creates a clue and food, that's fuel for the Ironworks, which in turn fuels our gain 2 colorless mana each, possibly 4 or 6. If that weren't enough, these artifacts are also good on their own, whether to draw us a card or gain us life in a pinch. There's plenty of artifact interaction and sacrifice interaction in the deck, so those tokens get even better than this. This assembly worker does some work assembling engines here. Treasure Vault and Treasure Map also create treasures, albeit the artifact land is clearly the better treasure creation effect. Treasure Vault is so epic here, and best of all, it doesn't take up a slot on the deck. This card is so synergistic. Just imagine its potential if we had either Goldsplan Dragon, Krark-Clan Irex, Zorn, or Academy Manufactor out. Insane. Treasure Map isn't bad, and we eventually get our return on investment with 3 treasures and a mana producing land. But that land, Treasure Cove, is amazing in the deck. We can tap it and sacrifice a treasure to draw a card, and treasure is something this deck will never not have. Being on a land also makes it difficult to interact with in a format where land destruction is frowned upon, so always use that to your advantage. Making the most of our mana production is crucial in a deck like this with so many impulsive draw effects. If we can't even cast that spell, we essentially lose it to Exile. That's the risk. However, if we're creating so many treasures and never missing a land drop whether from our library or opponents, we should be in the clear. That being said, don't over-season the deck with these types of effects. Outpost Siege has us exile the card at the beginning of our upkeep if we choose the cons mode, the obvious mode chosen. At least if we exile a land card this way, we can just play it, and then if we draw into any lands, keep them in our hand to play later or to recast Throes of Chaos from the graveyard. Valakut Exploration isn't as mean since at the end of the turn we can send to the graveyard any cows exiled with it. We also have a bit of control with it since the card is exiled via landfall triggers. As previously mentioned, if we're able to play a land per turn, this can help us go through our library no problem. In fact, the deck is running Ghirapur Orrery just for that very reason. Yes, the effect is symmetric, but if we exile 2 lands in the same turn, we'd only be able to play one of them. Also, if we exile multiple lands from opponents' libraries, we'd normally only be able to play one. But with the Orrery, we can play more than one, so while it might benefit opponents, it helps us out much more. Even more so since we can't ramp for land as well as other colors can. Although the deck is running Burnished Art for that land-based ramp. Even then, sacrificing it to ramp also synergizes with some other effects in the deck, which we'll soon see. At the very least, it can trigger Valakut Exploration twice. Same with the 8 fetch lands in the deck. They help thin the deck of lands, which is fewer lands to impulsively draw into, while also helping with mana fixing, and double triggering Valakut Exploration if you have it in play. Chandra Fire Artisan and Chandra Pyromaster both provide impulsive draw without losing loyalty counters for it. They're used mostly for that, but at least Pyromaster can take a blocker out of the equation if we want to swing in with Fiend of the Shadows or prevent a creature with Death Touch from blocking a tally. Both of their ultimates aren't the reason for running them, and I honestly just never do them. Fire Artisan's ultimate is quite the gamble if you exile a ton of cards you might not be even able to play. And if you can play them, it's just win more. Jessica's Will is amazing here, especially if we control Prosper. If an opponent has a lot of cards in hand, this will help us get ahead so far in the early game. On a side note, apart from Jessica's Will, we've already seen a couple of cards that interact with opponents' hands. In order to keep those hands big and ripe for the picking, Magus of the Moon and Blood Moon are included in the deck. On their own, they're amazing disruption since they're the best stacks effects against multicolored decks, and they don't hurt us that much, especially since we're creating so many treasures. Even less so if we control Chromatic Lantern. However, if opponents aren't able to play their spells, we can steal them from their hand, almost ensuring we have something to take from there. Even then, the best symmetrical disruptive effects in the deck that actually benefit us are Possibility Storm, Elkin Lair, and Uba Mask. The mask turns every card literally drawn into impulsively drawn, which can be quite risky but is an amazing gambit in the deck. If an opponent exiles a card they can't play, it stays exiled. If an opponent has any spells or effects that has them draw into a bunch of cards to keep a fat hand, they won't be able to. Any counter spells or responses they draw, they won't be able to keep since they stay exiled. So if you don't play anything in their turn, then you're safe. Possibility Storm also helps in this regard. If they cast a counter spell and don't reveal another instant that can counter a spell, then your spell is safe. Granted, this effect is symmetric, so you have the potential of turning a green player's Llanowar Elves into a Craterhoof Behemoth, but that's a risk I'm willing to take, especially when it benefits us so much more. Possibility Storm essentially makes all of our spells create treasure when we have Prosper out. And not only that, but we don't really mind what our spells become, so it's definitely going to be way more annoying for opponents than us. Elkin Lair does something similar but with a random card from players' hands. If we exile the land, just play it. But if we exile a spell, we might just end up casting it earlier than we meant to, but we're still able to do it, and it triggers Prosper and anything else that cares about spells being cast from exile. Also, don't forget about the World Enchantment rule. Birgi, God of Storytelling, also provides mana acceleration for spells we cast, however, she doesn't care where it is that we're casting the spell from. This can help us potentially fuel casting more spells from exile and not losing them. That being said, as good as Birgi is, we're not mainly casting her front side. More often than not, it's Harnfell, Horn of Bounty the side that we're casting. Again, just as with Valki and Tybalt, The update to the way Cascade works won't let us cast Harnfell off of Brewery, if Harnfell is more expensive than the cascaded spell. In any case, it's an amazing card here since we can discard a card to impulsively draw 2 cards. We're only able to cast them that turn, but if we're running out of gas, this will definitely speed things up. Then Prosper, creating treasures from those cards we play function in spirit to Brewery, giving us red mana. Sorkara the Bold and Oracle's Vault are some more impulsive card draw effects that we're in better control of since we choose when to activate them. Sorkara's ability not only triggers if she deals combat damage, but if she activates her pinging ability as well. If we do, then we exile the top card of our library in order to play it. Unfortunately, there's only one sorcery in the entire deck that can deal damage to an opponent, since this is the only way we can trigger Sorkara, which is still good enough for Prosper. Oracle's Vault is similar to Ornate Kanzashi, but for our own library. What's great about it is that when it finally gets 3 brick counters, because once it does, we can simply tap it and then play the top card of our library for free. So if we exile Brewery or Valki, we can actually play Harnfell or Tybalt with it. Speaking of playing things for free off the top of our library, Creative Technique and Ignite the Future do just that. The best thing about Creative Technique is that we have the potential of getting 2 cards from it if we allow an opponent to copy it. Again, it's risky if we do, but at least we have 2 opportunities not to whiff, while opponents only have 1. Ignite the Future is a bit of a risk since we're already paying 4 mana to cast it, and it's exiling 3 cards. Casting so many cards in a single turn might be a trifle difficult even with all the mana we can generate in the deck. So this is more for the mid to late game if we're running out of steam. That being said, if we cast it from our graveyard with Flashback, we can cast those cards for free. In order to make the most of these impulsive draw effects, the deck's running Sensi's Dividing Top. This will work for all of them except Creative Technique since it shuffles the deck first, but the top lets us program the top 3 cards of our library. We can leave in the top whichever card we don't care about impulsively drawing, like a cheap spell, or leaving a land on the top if the exiling ability will let us play a land instead of just being limited to spells. If for some reason all 3 cards are lands and our spells too expensive to cast, we could just tap the top to draw one of them and put it back on the top of our library. Then the top becomes that spell we can cast from exile for just 1 mana. The top is an amazing card in and of itself, but it doesn't belong in every commander deck. However, it belongs in every Prosper deck. Izzet Chemister, the final card exiling effect in the deck, is so good here. It might seem slow, but unlike similar cards, it doesn't have us cast copies of those spells it exiles. We cast the actual spells, thus triggering Prosper and any other effect that cares. The Chemister is especially good at exiling Profane Tutor and Wheel of Fate since they can't be cast otherwise, so we can cast them off of it, as well as any other instant or sorcery we might have in the graveyard, all for free. It's a shame that Yawgmoth's Testament is a playtest card and not thus legal in Commander. This card would be ridiculous here. If we have any face-up cards in exile that got stuck there because we couldn't play them, for 3 mana we can do so along with any other exiled card we own. Then when they resolve, they get bottom decked. But it is what it is. Alright, so how do we win? We can't just be casting spells from exile for the sake of it. Sure, we might steal some of our opponent's bombs, but what about our own bombs? Well, we can beat them down with cards like Layla the Blade Reforged, Jury Master of the Review, and Blood Aspirant. When Layla gets a +1/+1 counter for each card we exile from our library and our graveyard, it's only once per instance. So if we exile 3 at a time, she only gets 1 counter. But if we're doing it once a time in different moments of the turn, or even the same phase, then she gets the counter for each time. Although she doesn't have any built-in evasion, she becomes quite the beater if we can swing in with her. Same goes with Jury and Blood Aspirant. However, these trigger whenever we sacrifice a permanent. Like with Layla, they don't have any built-in evasion, but the Satyr can prevent a creature from blocking for 2 mana and sacrificing a creature or enchantment. Bonus points for sacrificing Jury to it, since then Jury will deal that much damage to any target. Even so, the deck is running Whispersoul Cloak for good measure. Not only will this give any of these beaters unblockable, but Shroud as well so that they can survive any targeted removal spell or effect. It's also not just for these, but to protect Prosper as well. So it's not just in the deck as an ubiquitous card for Commander. If we can't win via huge beater per opponent, then Marionette Master and Disciple of the Vault win via combo. It's safe to say that this deck is sacrificing a ton of artifacts. Not only will those pump Jury and the Satyr, but they'll also be hurting our opponents with these 2 creatures out. While Marionette Master is the better of the 2, it does cost 6 mana, whereas the zombie just costs 1. Now imagine either of these out on the battlefield along with Zorn and or Academy Manufactor, and you can already get a sense of how these engines work in more ways than one. Revel in Witches is another one way we can very easily just literally end the game. With the insane amount of treasures we're creating, this enchantment is a no-brainer here. Not only that, but it creates treasures itself whenever a creature an opponent controls dies. If we have this in our hand early enough, then we know to save as many treasures as we can in order to get this to go off. If not, then we can use all of the mana the deck generates to sink into a game-ending, exsanguinate, or crackle with power. These are some amazing mana sinks. If we're accumulating a ton of treasures and either have Card Clan Ironworks or Gold Splan Dragon, then these end the game even faster. Or maybe if we have Academy Manufacturer in the mix too, since we can send those clue and food tokens to the Ironworks. That being said, these are 4 more of the late game when life totals aren't in the 30s or 40s, so more often than not, they'll end the game, especially with Ouroboros Tomb of Yawgmoth and Cabal Coffers in the deck. Their inclusion here is pretty self-explanatory, but not taking up slots in the deck while also powering up spells like Exsanguinate and Crackle with Power helps in justifying their inclusion. Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, Arcane Signet, and Rakdos Signet are the other obvious inclusions in the deck. While the deck can generate tons of mana, it still needs to be able to cast those cards and get there, so getting these early on is important. If Mana Crypt is out of your budget, then just swap it out for Talisman of Indulgence. The rest of the deck is just the lands. The deck's running Battlelands, Blood Crypt, Canyon Slough, Smoldering Marsh, Sulphurous Mire, Luxury Suite, Tainted Peak, Dragon Skull Summit, and Command Tower, as well as 5 of each basic land. As with all of my deck techs, you don't need Badlands or the more expensive fetch lands if you aren't playing online, don't already have them, or don't want to proxy them. You can very easily swap them out for budget substitutes and the deck will still run just as well. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Prosper Tome-Bound. While there are definitely better ways to draw cards in black like Necropotence and the like, building a deck around Prosper makes other card draw effects better even if they're exiled and not actually in your hand. Keep in mind that this also makes it harder to interact with them with hand disruption effects. Keeping along that vein, most effects that steal things from opponents have you cast them from exile, which synergizes with so many possible engines. This makes Prosper not only a super fun commander, but a very interesting one. It also forces you to not only plan too far ahead, since you have to play your things fairly quickly, so this deck is not for those who get anxious in a commander game. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link, that also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am the Meta Kirby, and happy brewing.